رب العالمين وبه نستعين ونصلي ونسلم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. نعم. So Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, as we embark on this beautiful journey to attain knowledge regarding the sacred sciences, and from these sacred sciences, in order to actually, as a prerequisite, access the sacred sciences, we need to also study the science of syntax and learn the Arabic language. And bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala eases for us this journey and makes it a fruitful journey and allows us to engage in the beauty of this language so that we can eventually understand the sacred texts of the Quran and Sunnah in the best manner possible. We start off by making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rabbi yassir wa la tu'assir wa tammim bil khayr wa bika nasta'inu ya fattah. Rabbi yassir wa la tu'assir wa tammim bil khayr wa bika nasta'inu ya fattah. Rabbi yassir wa la tu'assir wa tammim bil khayr wa bika nasta'inu ya fattah. So number one, to begin with, today we'll go through a little bit of a introduction regarding the reality of language and the Arabic language and how many different disciplines are actually branching off from the Arabic language. And then we will focus more on the exact discipline that we are going to study in this beautiful book of Al-Tuhfah Al-Saniyyah, the Sharh of Al-Ajrumiyyah, one of the most famous shuruh that have been compiled in this regard. So in Jami' Durus Al-Arabiyyah, he says, اللغة ألفاظ يعبر بها كل قوم عن مقاصدهم. In reality, what is a language? So we start off with first understanding what languages are. He says, language consists of words by which every people express their intentions. A language is simply words that are symbolic for concepts and ideas that are in the mind. The purpose of a language is simply to display and relay information that is actually understood in one's mind. He says, وَاللُّغَاتُ كَثِيرًا. There are many different types of languages. وَهِيَ مُخْتَلِفَةٌ مِنْ حَيْثُ اللَّفْظِ. And these languages, they are different in terms of the vocabulary, in terms of the words that are used. So for example, in the Arabic language, the words that you use are not the same as the words you use in the English language. Likewise, you're not going to find that, for example, in Hebrew or in Urdu, or for example in Chinese or in other languages that are out there. He says, وَهِيَ مُخْتَلِفَةٌ مِنْ حَيْثُ اللَّفْظِ مُتَّحِدَةٌ مِنْ حَيْثُ الْمَعْنَى. But in reality, the meanings that are trying to be conveyed using these different words, they're actually the same exact meaning. Meaning the same concept is just worded with different languages. And that's what you find in the dictionary. For example, if you look up the word, for example, let's say the word wall, the wall in the dictionary. In Arabic, we say jidar, for example. In English, you say wall. In some other language, you use another word. But the concept is the same. The idea is the same. So these words are simply symbolic, and in the end, they're referring to the same exact concept in the mind. The same idea which is found in the mind. So the concepts in reality are the same. What differs are the words that are used. So he says, أي أن المعنى واحد الذي يخالج ضمائر الناس واحد. This means that the same meaning which resonates in the heart of the people is one. In the concept which is occurring within the minds of the individuals, that is one concept and that is one idea. The languages, yes, they differ. He says, وَلَكِنَّ كُلَّ قَوْمٍ يُعَبِّرُونَ عَنْهُ بِلَفْظٍ غَيْرِ لَفْظِ الْآخَرِينَ. However, each people, each group of people express that concept with a word that is different from the others. So this is the reality of languages. The whole purpose of the language is to convey a meaning. That's why initially when you go back to how languages began, we say they started off with, for example, drawings or pictures or illusions, illustrations that were used to convey an idea. Because the ideas were in the mind, but they wanted to convey these concepts forward. So they would start off, for example, with illustrations, and using illustrations, they used to convey meanings. And eventually they started realizing that we can actually use sounds that can also convey the same concept as an illustration. So the same way that an actual picture is symbolic for a concept, likewise we say a sound is symbolic for a concept. And so they started developing these sounds and using sounds to convey those meanings and creating patterns. And this is how languages evolved over time. طيب. He says واللغة العربية هي الكلمات التي يعبر بها العرب عن أغراضهم. طيب, the Arabic language. What is the Arabic language? In reality, is simply those words by which the Arabs express their purposes and their ideas and the concepts that they have in their mind. So the group of individuals that are called the Arab, the Arabs, they use those words to express a concept which is in their mind. طيب, how have these words reached us? He says وَقَدْ وَصَلَتْ إِلَيْنَا مِنْ طَرِيقٍ النَّقْلِ. These words have really reached us by way of transmission. وحفظها لنا القرآن الكريم والأحاديث الشريفة وما رواه الثقات من منثور العرب ومنظومهم. Likewise, they were preserved for us by way of the noble Quran and the honorable ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as well as what has been narrated by trustworthy sources from prose and poetry of the Arabs, meaning the normal literature of the Arab that is not rhyming, and the literature of the Arab that was created and made to rhyme upon the scales of the poets of poetry. So the language of Arabic reached us generation upon generation, and people continue to speak it and use it and so on and so forth until it reached us today. And in this language, we're simply looking at words. The Arabs, they use these words, and these words are symbolic for a concept and an idea. And the whole purpose of the language is communication, conveying that idea which is in the mind over to the individual that you are addressing. طيب, then he says, لما خشي أهل العربية عن ضياعها بعد أن اختلطوا بالأعاجم دونوها في المعاجم وأصلوا لها أصولا تحفظها من الخطأ وتسمى هذه الأصول العلوم العربية. After the Islamic Empire expanded in the time of Omer radiallahu ta'ala anhu, so we had massive expansions that occurred in the time of the Khilafah Rashida, the early conquests in the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, as well as Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, especially after the Battle of Nahawand and Qadisiyah. The entire Persian Empire had fallen at the hands of the Muslim, and likewise east and west, far east and west, the Muslims were able to liberate many lands and spread the beautiful message of Islam across these many lands. And after they had spread far and wide, what ended up happening is that there was a problem. And what was that problem? That problem was that there were many a'ajim, individuals that are actually non-Arab. They don't know the Arabic language at all. And they entered into the Muslim lands, or the Muslim lands encompassed them. And since the Muslim lands encompassed them, and many of them accepted Islam, the difficulty that arose was, how do they learn how to address or speak with the Muslims? Now, normally this wouldn't be that big of a problem, as in just simply talking to each other, communication, and eventually people learn languages. But the issue that arose, the main issue, is that the Quran is also in the Arabic language. So yes, if let's say people are speaking normally, like in the marketplace or in transactions and so on and so forth, mistakes are acceptable. It's fine even if people make mistakes. It's not that big of a deal. The problem is that when it comes to the Quran, these mistakes are not acceptable. These mistakes are not acceptable. And they can potentially result in changing the meaning completely, as we're going to mention, inshallah, in the future. And as you will understand by learning the science of syntax, how important, making sure that the correct presentation or the rules are kept intact in order for the meaning to correctly be conveyed, and how detrimental and dangerous it can be for a person to make mistakes in some of these grammatical rules, as we're going to study throughout the course, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But after the Muslims expanded and they realized that there were many individuals that were entering into Islam and they were not aware of the Arabic language, and slowly the Arabic language was mixing with other languages and it was losing its touch, they had a problem that they had to address, which is, how do they preserve the language? So he says there's different aspects of preservation. One is the words, the vocabulary of the language. He says they documented that in ma'ajim, in dictionaries, and made sure that the words were preserved and they knew exactly what these words referenced and they meant. And more words were created, as occurs with the merging of any entire civilizations, for example. And he says, وَأَصَّلُوا لَهَا أُصُولًا تَحْفَظُهَا مِنَ الْخَطَأِ. Likewise, they established rules to safeguard it from mistakes and errors. وَتُسَمَّى هَذِهِ الْأُصُولِ الْعُلُومِ الْعَرَبِيَّةِ. So they created rules that would protect their language from mistakes that would occur. And those mistakes can be detrimental and they can change the meanings. So they had to make sure that the meanings remained intact, and they had to make sure that they would codify the language that was originally spoken. So the rules actually come second. Initially they spoke the language, and later on the rules were established. The rules were established later on, after initially the language was simply being spoken. The language was simply being spoken. طيب. He goes on. He says, these rules that they ended up compiling, these rules are what we call, or what we refer to as al-ulum al-arabiyyah, the Arabic sciences. So what are the Arabic sciences? All of the disciplines that actually stem and go back to the Arabic language. He says, فَالْعُلُومُ الْعَرَبِيَّةِ هي العلوم التي يتوصل بها إلى عصمة اللسان والقلم عن الخطأ. When we say the Arabic sciences, or the sciences and disciplines that pertain to the Arabic language, there are those disciplines through which one can safeguard the tongue and pen from error, from making a mistake when it comes to the Arabic language. Now, these disciplines divide into many different categories. And the reason for that is because there's different perspectives of looking at the language. For example, one is speaking the language, the pronunciation of the letters. That also has to do with the language. So you have to make sure that the letters are being pronounced correctly. Then every language, for example, when you look at the literature of the language, and you have to do with writing the language, even that written portion of the language can divide into different categories. So for example, some of the written portion of the language can have to do with rhymes, or it can rhyme, and that is what we call ash-shi'r, poetry. And some of the literature aspect of that language doesn't rhyme. That's what we call nathar. So each one would have its own rules. Poetry would have its own rules that would govern how it works. As for nathar, it would have its own rules that would govern how it works. Likewise, you have different aspects of the language that have to do with presentation, speaking the language, delivering the language in a presentable manner. When do you stop? Where do you continue? How do you present the information, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to the language, you're not only looking at the grammatical rules, right? It's not only simply looking at grammar or syntax and how the sentence is composed, but there's much more to a language than that. Reading, writing, listening, understanding, and so on and so forth. Communicating. Languages divide into multiple different branches. And likewise in the Arabic language, we don't have one discipline that is stemming from the Arabic language. We have a number of disciplines. In fact, he says, وَهِيَ ثَلَاثَةَ عَشَرَ عِلْمًا. There are 13 different types of disciplines that all go back to the Arabic language. He says, number one, as-sarf. Okay, morphology. And morphology is that discipline that has to do with the composing of the word and looking at each of the harakat on each of these words. So for example, when I say this word as-sarf, I say as-sarf and I don't say as-sirf. Right, so I'm putting a fatha on the sad, and likewise I'm putting a sukoon on the ra. Like, could it be, for example, with a kasra on the sad, or a kasra on the ra, or a fatha on the ra, or a dhamma on the sad, like a different harakah, for example? Could that be the case? Could it be a different vowel that we use? The answer is, who determines which vowels are used, or who determines the actual composition of the initial 1, 2, 3 beginning letters of the word and the middle letters of the word? We say that is the science of morphology. That is the science of sarf. We also have the science of i'rab, which is syntax. And the science of i'rab does not have to do with the composition of the word. Rather, it has to do with, as we're going to mention, inshallah, the gist of it has to do with putting words together to create sentences. And all of this will come in detail بإذن ta'ala. He says, وَيَجْمَعُهُمَا اسْمُ النَّحْوِ. Both of these collectively are referred to with the term nahu. Both of these are collectively referred to with the term nahu. But is that it? No. We also have ar-rasm, the method of writing the language. So how do you write the language? How do you write the letters? Where do you place the dots? Okay, what's the difference between the ya that has the 2 dots underneath and the noon, for example, which has the 1 dot on top? Or the ba and the ya, for example, we say ba has 1 dot underneath and ya has 2 dots underneath. So there has to be a language that will also determine for us how to write the letters. And that can actually change over time. And it did change over time. Initially, these dots were not upon the letters. Then when they were initially introduced to clarify exactly which letters are which, they weren't all introduced in the same manner. Some people could have differed in the way they would mention or place the dots and where they would place them. So this changed over time, and therefore you have an entire discipline that is regarding it, which will go through the history of how these dots were placed and where they were placed and different places and lands of the Arabic world or the Muslim world, and how they would place the dots and which dots they would place, and so on and so forth. So it becomes an entire discipline in of itself. Likewise, we have al-ma'ani, semantics, or this is actually has to do with rhetoric and how you use the words to convey profound meanings. Likewise, you have al-bayan and al-badi'. Al-bayan goes back to rhetoric, and al-badi' also goes back to rhetoric, and all of these three are combined with the name of balagha. So al-ma'ani, al-bayan, and al-badi' all go back to the concept of al-balagha, which is using rhetorical devices and figurative language, and how to make the meaning of the words far more impactful, and how to structure the sentences in a way that the concept is far more profound and more impactful. Likewise, we have al-urud wal-qawafi. Al-urud wal-qawafi. So, for example, you have al-urud and al-qawafi has to do with the poetry and the scales of poetry, and how the rhyming, or how each line of the verses of poetry should end. And you have qarad al-sha'r and shi'r, and al-insha. Insha means writing. If someone wants to write a piece of literature, how should he write it? Al-khataba has to do with speaking, oratory skills. Tarikh al-adab, going through all of the history regarding Arabic literature. What was compiled? How was it compiled? Matn al-lugha. So we have a number of different sciences, that all disciplines that will all actually go back to the Arabic language. And as the author says over here, there are 13 different disciplines that go back all the way to the Arabic language. طيب, he says وجمع بعضهم بعض تلك العلوم في قوله. Some have summarized all of these sciences in the following few couplets. علوم آداب ثمانية لغة صرف ونحو والمعاني المفضلة. وكذا بيان والبديع وقافية وكذا عروض فاطلبنها مجملة وفروعها إنشاء نثر والنظام ومحاضرات والخطوط فأجملة. The sciences of literature, 8 in all, some gathered 8. Morphology, syntax, and semantics stand tall. Rhetoric and critique with rhyme to refine. Prosody, seek these and knowledge you'll find. In their branches include both prose and verse. Lectures and scripts for the learners converse. So we have a number of different sciences. Some have gathered them in these few couplets. Also, some have said صرف بيان معاني النحو قافية شعر عروض اشتقاق الخط إنشاء محاضرات وثاني عشرها لغة تلك العلوم لها الآداب أسماء. And some gathered them in these lines as well. So in reality, we have a number of different lines and a number of different ulum, a number of different disciplines that are stemming from the Arabic language. Now, for our purpose in this book, we are going to be going through the discipline of Nahwu. So from all of these disciplines, the discipline that this book is regarding is with regards to is the discipline of syntax, is the discipline of al-i'rab or al-nahwu. And this is one of the most essential disciplines when it comes to the Arabic language, because this is the discipline that teaches you how to actually compose a sentence, how to actually put a sentence together, how to actually word a sentence, how to make a sentence. And it is the ruh, it's the spirit of what is going to render a sentence either valid and correct or invalid and incorrect. And this is the science, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, that we're going to be going through in this beautiful book. Now, when it comes to Al-Tuhfah Al-Saniyyah, this is a beautiful book compiled, and it's one of the most well-renowned and globally recognized works in Nahwu. Usually after Al-Ajrumiyyah, they teach Al-Tuhfah Al-Saniyyah to students as a second level. I would suggest this is maybe between beginner and intermediate. Maybe initially, if a person is exposed to something even more basic than Ajrumiyyah, then Al-Tuhfah Al-Saniyyah, then it would make more sense. And so it would be a level which is between beginner and intermediate, leaning more towards the intermediate side. And then after this, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we have further levels that a person can expand on, and other books that a person will study in order to solidify his understanding of Nahwu and Arabic syntax. And this is the book that we're going to be going through, insha'Allah ta'ala. Today, I didn't want to elaborate too much, but just to give you an idea that there are a number of disciplines within the Arabic language, and we are actually going to be going through one of the most important ones, which is Nahwu. In the next lesson, we're going to start off describing the definition of Nahwu, syntax as a discipline, and the whole purpose of this ilm. So what is the actual benefit of this science? How do we actually understand this science? What is the actual purpose of this science. We're going to go through that bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, so you understand exactly what you're looking for in Al-Tuhfah Al-Saniyyah. And then we're going to go through the book, inshallah ta'ala, in order to make sense of all of this, and in order to better our reading skills and our comprehension skills, and eventually build up to our understanding of the Quran and Sunnah bi'idhnillahi ta'ala.